Things are heating up again in Ukraine. Now, obviously, the Russians have pretty much taken Crimea, and they appear to be going further and further into the mainland of Ukraine. They have actually gone into 10 different cities now in eastern and southern Ukraine. Now, of course, they claim, no, it's not us. It just happens to be pro-Russian people on the ground who are insurgents, not coordinated by us at all. No. Now, there have been shootings. 2 people were killed and 9 have been wounded. And they are in, like I said, about 10 different cities. Now, Samantha Power, our UN ambassador, spoke out about this. She said it's professional and coordinated, nothing grassroots about it. So that's addressing the concern that it might just be the locals that are rising up because they're so pro-Russia and anti-Ukraine. Well, she went on to say the forces are doing in each of the 6 or 7 cities. At the time, it was 6 or 7. Now it's closer to 10. They have been active in exactly the same thing. So certainly, it bears the telltale signs of Moscow's involvement. In other words, look, you don't have these coordinated attacks in all these different cities using the same exact tactics if they happen to be people that were on the ground who were just outraged and happened to pick up a Kalashnikov and head off in that direction, and golly gee, they happen to take over a police station in just the same way that someone 7 towns over did. That would appear to be directed. Now, here's why we're going to have a lot of trouble. First of all, that's an incursion into the Ukraine proper. That is an enormous issue. Number 2, the governor of the Donetsk region, Serhiy Turuta, says about the people who are doing these incursions, quote, they are terrorists, and we will not let them rule on our land. And in fact, the Russian government has been warned by the Ukrainians, hey, you know what, we're going to strike back. So they have not struck back yet, but tick-tock, tick-tock. And in fact, the acting president, Alexander Tuchnyov, has called for United Nations peacekeeping forces, along with Ukrainian forces, to push back against the forces that have seized these police stations, government buildings, etc. in those 10 cities. Now, what is going to be the Russian reaction? Russia has warned that the Kiev government against using force against the protesters in the east. In other words, this is the Russians saying, us having anything to do with peaceful protesters that came in shooting? We don't know anything about that. But if you were to use force against their force, well, I guess, golly gee, we'd have to act, wouldn't we? That does not bode well. More details. Russian foreign minister says the crisis in Ukraine was due to the failure of the Ukrainian government to take into account the legitimate needs and interests of the Russian and Russian-speaking population. Now, that's exactly what they said about Crimea. And as we've told you before, historically, exactly what the Soviet Union said before they came into other people's land. But the Germans used the same excuse at the same time in the 1930s, saying that they were just trying to protect the German-speaking population and the ethnic Germans in that area. That's why they had to seize that entire country. It does not appear that Putin is going to stop in Crimea, so we've got massive trouble in our hands. Associated Press explains that in Sloviansk, the mayor said the men who seized the police station were demanding a referendum on autonomy and possible annexation by Russia. In other words, the same exact thing that they demanded in Crimea. They're just repeating the playbook. In fact, all of the protesters go and chant 2 things, referendum, referendum, and Russia, Russia. In other words, we think that this is an area that has more ethnic Russians. And by the way, by the time we have the vote, we'll have the guns on the ground, just like we did in Crimea. And whether it's a legitimate vote, the minority in that area, whether they happen to be Ukrainian, Tatar, or anything else, whether they'll show up is a different question. But we're going to go ahead and liberate these parts of Ukraine. Trouble. And look at that. As the Russians say that, they are concerned about the Russian people there, and perhaps a referendum should be considered. Protesters in other eastern cities have made similar demands, but they're not at all coordinated, of course not. Finally, we go one more time to the Associated Press explanation of how the Russians will react if anyone were to shoot back at their legitimate, protesters that happen to go into police stations shooting. Russia's foreign ministry on Friday warned the Ukrainian government against using force against protesters, saying that such action would derail the talks on settling the crisis between the United States, the European Union, Russia, and Ukraine set for next week, as well as any other diplomatic efforts. In other words, you better let us keep it. If you fire back, we're going to come in like a bulldozer. The Ukrainians have to fight back. And when they do, the Russians will bring in, it appears, from every warning sign you can see here, the heavy artillery. So here we are again with Russians rolling in tanks to countries that are not theirs.